to start this off as simply as I do my 10th grade classes, with some good old-fashioned hand raising. So I'm going to make a few statements, and then if you agree, you raise your hand, okay? Cake is superior to pie. Cats are better than dogs. Aliens exist. Children are our future. This latter point is presented as one of the most unifying and least controversial ideas in our very controversial society. What a simple and heartwarming and action-inspiring statement, right? What an easy thing to agree with, especially at an event with a theme forward. Children are our forward. As our future, they should be of supreme importance, a focal point of our resources. This idea is at the very core of my calling as a teacher. But here's the funny thing I've learned during my 15 years as a history teacher and my 21 years as an American citizen. In this country, children are not, and have never been, treated as our future. In this country, that statement is a platitude. It's a lip service payment. Many of you parents here who pay large percentages of your salaries to various tuitions and extracurriculars, who have made vast sacrifices for your children and maybe changed your whole life with this idea that they are your future, perhaps you vehemently disagree with me. And perhaps some of you students here who have watched your parents shuttle you back and forth from extracurriculars to parties and more may also disagree with me. And I'm not trying to say that this idea is not true on an individual and personal basis. What I want to suggest today is that as a society, America is not and has never been invested in this idea that children are our future. And in my opinion, it's one of the main reasons we are struggling so much as a nation today. Let's start with the historical argument. The statement, children are our future, is an extremely new idea in American and, in fact, human history. If you'd said such a statement to somebody in 1607 when the Virginia Company was formed, or in 1787 when the Constitution's written, or in 1860 when the Civil War starts, you would most likely have been met with expressions of confusion and maybe derision. Some of you might now be thinking, well, what about people like King Henry VIII? That guy was willing to divorce 2 wives and behead 2 others for the express purpose of getting a son. So surely he must have believed that children were his future. To an extent, that's true. For hereditary rulers or aristocrats, children were the future in so much as they were needed to inherit your property or your nation. So if you had said to King Henry VIII, your child is the future of England, he would have agreed. But if you had said children are our future and implicated everyone from his son to the sons of his servants and peasants and criminals in his dungeon, he would likely have frowned at you in that scowly, jowly way that artists have captured so accurately. Because the reality is that for most people throughout history, children have actually been commodities. They were both necessary and expendable. The average person in medieval Europe, or since we're focusing on America here, in colonial Virginia, would have worked on having as many children as they could possibly manage. Not because they intended to send them all to fancy preschools aimed like bazookas at Harvard or Yale, or because they thought they were raising a future president or curer of cancer or someone important in the future, but because children were literally labor. You had the option as a farmer to hire laborers or to breed them. The more children you had, the more hands there were in the fields. Boys were therefore preferable, but you could still marry your girls off to boys who would also work for you. You had a lot of children also because they tended to die a lot. To give you a sense of how expendable children were, here's a statistic from Daniel Walker Howe's Pulitzer Prize winner, What Hath God Wrought? In America in 1815, he writes that the child mortality rate, which is ages of children between 0 and 10, was roughly 1/3 for white children and 1/2 for black children. They died of diseases, so they died of smallpox, typhoid, polio, and flu. They died of bacterial infections, everything from pneumonia to a bad scrape, because there were no such thing as antibiotics. They died from diabetes and cystic fibrosis and asthma and other things that there were no medications to control. They died because they were trampled by a horse or a cow or because they fell into the fireplace. Because after all, with an average of 7 children per woman, In America, there wasn't always somebody to watch out for a child's safety. For the majority of American history, children could not be your future because it was almost guaranteed that you would lose them. You had as many as possible so as to breed replacements. Just take a look at name records. For centuries, families would name sons, especially, the same name. Medieval church records, for example, will list 4 to 5 Johns in a single family, the father and all the sons. They were all named John because, according to the system of patrilineal inheritance, only one would inherit the father's property. And child mortality rates were so high that the first John, and perhaps the second John, and perhaps even the third John might die. So it was good to have a backup fourth John. For these reasons, if you were an average American between the 1600s and 1800s, it was not a very good idea to invest too much in your children either. Schooling was unimportant if their main role was to labor for you, and too much of a gamble if they died before actually using their learned skills. Most American children went to work, either in the fields or after industrialization in the factories, at age 6. For this same reason, you didn't invest in many toys either. Toys were a rarity for many children for much of American history. In Puritan Massachusetts, for example, toys were frowned upon because play was considered frivolous. Children were considered small adults, and their young years were to be spent in prayer and work. The first toy store didn't even open up until 1760 in London and remained a rarity elsewhere in the world, even in large cities, until the 20th century. Toys that children did have were usually homemade, like a corn husk doll, or balls made from the bladders of farm animals. The idea of a playground wasn't even considered until 1859, when the first children's playground was built in Manchester, England. Poor American kids had to wait until 1887, when the first playground was built in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. My students are always very amused when they see paintings or photos of American children throughout history. They're always dressed like weird, tiny adults. And there's a twofold reason for this. Firstly, children's clothes did not exist. So children's clothes were just adult clothes made very small. The idea of children having separate types of clothes than adults would have necessitated the idea of children existing in a separate phase of life to adults. And this leads me to the second reason children look so weird in old images, because the concept of childhood itself was non-existent for most of human history. The concept of childhood, which is this special phase between infanthood and adulthood, where innocence and dependence prevails, is thought to have originated in the 1600s, but it wasn't a reality for most kids until many centuries later. Historians argue actually that it wasn't until the 19th century in America when child mortality rates began to decline, along with birth rates, and compulsory public schooling spread across the states, that the concept of childhood became something visible and experienced by the masses. And it wasn't until the market economy, fueled by industrialization, realized that children could be capitalized on that it resembled anything like our modern concept. So one could really argue that it was capitalism that created modern childhood. Schools and summer camps and extracurriculars and movies and TV shows and toys, clothes and gadgets and a million other consumer goods. So here we are in 21st century America. Over the course of the 20th century, plummeting child mortality rates, compulsory schooling, and child labor laws, plus the bursting open of the children's commercial market, have made childhood appear to us to be a vaunted and precious, beautiful, vastly important time. Families pour money into children, and these costs have gone up extravagantly in recent years, prompting hand-wringing journalists to bemoan falling birth rates and Gen Z's declarations of planned childlessness. Surely, we think, this must indicate how precious children are to us. Surely this must be declarative of our intense belief in the mantra that children are our future. But if that is the case, why are the majority of America's poor children? Why? According to the latest US Census data, are approximately 16.3% of children in poverty, much higher than the overall poverty rate of 12.6%. If children's lives are so precious to us, why is it that depression in teens, according to a recent CDC study, why is it that that's present in almost half that population? a whopping 44%, which prompted the declaration of a national mental health crisis for this group. Why have there been 416 school shootings since Columbine in 1999? Why are guns the leading cause of death for children and teens? If children are our future, why are the people in our society who care for them consistently the worst paid? For example, why are daycare providers and teachers paid so dismally with non-existent or poor benefits? Why do families struggle so immensely to find care for their children when daycares and after-school programs are so expensive and the idea of universal free daycare or pre-K are consistently struck down? Why are pediatricians the lowest paid of all doctors? Why do 3.9 million children in America not have health insurance? Why are social workers specializing in CPS, the people who see the worst abuses against children and are tasked with assisting and preventing these, paid less in Texas even than the most underpaid of teachers? And lest we forget how important their work is and how necessary it is, and also how few of them there are to meet the current need, the American SBCC declared in 2022 that it had acted on over 3 million reported cases of child abuse or neglect. Why is the foster care system in America so horrifically broken? So understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed, with almost 400,000 children and less than 200,000 foster houses, not to mention declining federal funding since the year 2000. Why do more than half of Americans say that our public school system is moving in the wrong direction? And why have achievement scores in almost every category gone down year after year? Why have so many states decreased funding for education? And why are politicians at the federal level talking about abolishing the Department of Education entirely? Why have child labor violations in the US soared in recent years, to the extent that journalists are winning Pulitzers by exposing horrific hours and conditions from child laborers that haven't been heard of since the 19th century? Why every year do colleges become increasingly impossible for the average American child to afford, lest they take on ruinous debt? Why is it looking increasingly impossible for today's American children to afford houses when they reach adulthood? In other words, why do we seem to recognize childhood as something to be capitalized on, but not protected? Why do we say children are our future when as a society, we don't really mean it? Perhaps it's because, even if we don't realize it, the concept is still new. Perhaps we're held back by our historical understanding of childhood. Perhaps our collective consciousness still believes them to be commodities, or more accurately today, a vastly lucrative market. Things that make our collective society money, just look at Disney, but aren't worth our collective society's money. Perhaps we are still operating within institutions that treat them expendable, as creatures not worth investing too much into because they may not survive very long. But what if we dug deeply into the system and rooted out these historical beliefs entirely? What if we inverted the system? What if instead of the bulk of our resources going towards adults, we redirected them to children? What if we ensured that the institutions that work to protect the mental, physical, and emotional health of our children were the best funded institutions in our society? Our current system is shockingly inverted. Under almost every president since 1980, 80% of the real growth in domestic spending has gone to Social Security and healthcare, with Medicare the most expensive health program. Because state governments have stripped colleges and universities of funding, the average student debt a kid takes on each year is about 7 times that they did in 1971. As the New York Times wrote in a recent article, younger generations are more likely to fall into lower income classes than their parents or grandparents. Nearly half a century ago, it was the reverse. What I want to do right now is plant the seed of this idea. What if we as a society, not as individual parents focused on our own kids, what if we as a society prioritized all our children as the most important of our citizens? I don't mean, of course, that this would imply we should care less about American adults or the elderly, but I do mean to suggest that our policies right now indicate that we care less about American children than any other group. What would America look like if we really did manage to make our children the #1 priority? What would our future look like if we truly empowered our children to create it? I've asked enough whys and enough whats. I challenge you to act on the hows. Thank you for your time.